Continue on. The young girl just says, teasingly, maybe provokingly, she cocked her head to one side. So that's why your daddy left you? I babysat Whitney Swin the second and final time exactly a week later. Her parents were going to a party that night. The Moor, despite her wrinkled skin, looked smashing in a tight turquoise tube dress and shimmery lipstick. She wasn't quite as friendly as last time, and mentioned something about mildew in the hamper, how they like to keep their house neat and sanitary. Did I understand? I nodded and smiled, peering at her high-heeled pumps, listening to them click, clack, click, as the far kissed Whitney twice on the top of the head before heading out. In the time since seeing Whitney, I'd thought about her constantly, not truly about her, but about that mole on her back, that one smirch on her otherwise pristine body. I couldn't get over how separate it looked from the rest of her, like you could pluck it off and stick it anywhere, maybe between the eyebrows like a bindi. I went to bed and dreamed about the mole, imagining Whitney covered with raisinette spots, how her father would pull out his hair if he ever saw her like that. I envisioned her covered in so many moles that her skin looked brown from a distance, brown as Mr. Agarwal's. Only up close could you see the contrast between light and dark. This time around I wasn't cautious in the house. I roved the place like I owned it, opening cabinets as I pleased and fingering white marble counters, cold steel appliances, a coffee machine with so many buttons, knobs, and lights it looked like a computer. Yoo-hoo! And individual sized bags of Doritos and Cheetos lined the pantry. All this junk, I thought, and still the family skinny. I descended into the den, which was truly the basement, another no trespassing zone. But whilst Mr. Agarwal's basement smelled putrid and crawled with centipedes every spring, the Swins boasted a full-size Miss Pac-Man arcade, gumball machine, pool table, and true life traffic light hanging from the ceiling. I watched it blink green, red, yellow, then back to green again. Whitney followed me downstairs. She was talking a mile a minute, asking all sorts of questions. I think she was trying to win me over just for the sport of it, like luring a dog with meat scraps only to smack it in the nose when it comes near. When she understood that I intended to ignore her, she stomped back upstairs hostily, and I spent the rest of the night playing Miss Pac-Man. At 11:30 the Swins returned, their breath smelling sour malty like my Far's used to. Mrs. Swin wobbled unsteadily in her high heels. "So how did it go?" she asked. "Fine, ma'am." Whitney went to bed without a problem. I'd ordered her to her room at 9 o'clock. "Put on your pajamas and get under the sheets," were the only words out of my mouth all night. She was an angel. "Nice. Glad to hear it. Wait a minute now." She and Mr. Swin disappeared into the kitchen, and I could hear them discussing how much they ought to pay me. They'd forgotten to give me anything last time, and I'd been too sheepish to ask. Whilst Mrs. Swin complained, Mr. Swin mentioned how they used to give Amy 3 times as much. But in our country the dollar is worth further, she argued. The debate degenerated until finally she left with a huff, nearly grazing me as she tottered to the bedroom. I was still waiting for Mr. Swin and whatever money he was going to give me when she reappeared, glowering and panting. For the first time I noticed that her nostrils were inflamed and a little crusty. She threw her hands into the air and hollered for her husband to come. When he did, bills in hand, she pointed at me, her raw-hide face streaky with mascara and tears. "She's gone through my jewelry box. I found it wide open. One of my diamond earrings is missing." Although I couldn't see Whitney, I could imagine her well enough, opening her door a crack, her hair a nimbus in the darkness. She'd be covering a smirk with her hand. Maybe she was clutching the earring with the other, or maybe she'd had another adventure with the toilet. "Ma'am, I didn't take anything, I swear to you." "Empty your pockets right now." I winced. I said, "Now." I did better than that. I took off my clothes, shook them out, even my shoes and socks. I stood in my underwear, my pot belly hanging over my flower-dotted underpants, anything to put Whitney in her place. She must have given it to someone. Who knows what kind of people she let in? Half of Mexico could have tromped through this house by now. "Calm down, Misty. Let's think this through." Stony-faced, Mr. Swin turned to me. "I think it's time for you to go home, Jaishri." He surprised me by pronouncing my name correctly. I wanted to defend myself, to point out the obvious, like if I were going to steal jewelry, why would I take one earring? But then, as so often when I got nervous, the words clogged in my throat and I felt choked. Before I knew it, Mrs. Swin was throwing my clothes at me and showing me to the door, her hand like a vice on my shoulder. I didn't even have time to get my footwear on before finding myself on the doorstep. As I tied my laces, I could hear them ragging inside. I could hear them raging inside. What the hell was that about? We're supposed to drop her home, Mr. Swin said. You've got to be kidding. There's no way you're driving that scum. Let her walk. I did walk all the way to Mr. Archibald's house. I didn't have the money or inclination to call my Moor and explain the situation, and anyhow I felt guilty, even if I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, or much wrong. It took me 4 hours to walk all the way. I got lost in the dark once or twice, and by the time I got there she was pacing on the porch. She looked like she wasn't sure whether to hit me or hug me, and so she started talking instead. She told me that Mr. Archibald had called the Swins. They'd said I'd decided to walk home and that they wouldn't be needing my services any further. I listened carefully, waiting for a crescendo, but she didn't mention anything about the earring, only that Mr. Archibald was out in the Buicks trolling the streets. After calling me reckless and stupid, she started to fire questions, but then she saw how exhausted I must have looked and sat me down to feed me warm gulab jamun balls and a glass of milk. Kneeling on the floor, she took off my footwear and looked at the newly sprung blisters on my feet. When Mr. Archibald appeared, I was so tired I could barely stay upright in the chair. They sent me to bed long into the night. I glided in and out of sleep, listening to them prattle on. They discussed how badly the little girl's parents had treated me. What kind of people were they? They tried to agree on a course of action, whether they should contact the police, the Department of Children's Services, or if they should see the Swins in person, maybe write a letter of complaint. But in the end, my Moor nixed all those options. She had decided she didn't want to pursue the matter any further, and she didn't want to hear the Swin's name, not ever again. The Buicks, surprisingly quiet for such a bulky old clunker. The Buicks, surprisingly quiet for such a bulky old clunker. I remember that when Mr. Archibald purrs up behind me. I'm gazing at the creepers. He gets out and points to a looming pile of clay in the yard. It's hard to miss, I tell him. You got further on the way once you're done with this one. Great. There are buckets in the shed. You'll have to haul it a little at a time. The creepers aren't nice, I say, flashing my scraped arms, a last-ditch effort. I'll clear a path for you. The machete's in the shed, too. The machete? What are you, an Amazon? He ignores this. Your Moor called whilst you were gone. Yeah, what does she want? How should I know, Sherlock? She wants you to call her back. He goes to retrieve the machete, which looks as menacing as you'd think. Oil glistens on the blade. Mr. Archibald has done this before, I can tell. As he starts hacking through the vines, the machete seems to slice effortlessly through the riotous vegetation. When the path materializes in full, Master Archibald deposits the machete in the shed and comes out with the buckets. He sets them at my feet and says the rest is up to me. I work for hours that first day, shoveling, hauling, heaving, and pouring. Calluses start to mottle my palms. I work until the soleil descends and the stench of wild mint fills my nostrils. I work until Miss Archibald comes out with a glass of iced tea, mint sprigs drowning at the bottom, and tells me dinner's ready. Borscht, he says, sounding both hopeful and ashamed. I got your Moor's recipe. Dad's recipe, I correct him. I don't want dinner. I'm not hungry. Sorry. All I want is to fill that well, to see clay brimming over the top. He looks glum but shrugs resignedly. Suit yourself. After that, I don't take my meals regularly, but I gorge myself on the overripe tomatoes. I eat them like apples, a dozen a day, biting into the pinched, puckered skin, letting the soleil-swarm juices dribble down my chin. Even without the tomatoes, though, I'm filled. Working on the well, I feel the clay sliding coarse down my gullet, grinding away at my tender parts. I'm packed down, and I don't anticipate any lightening of the weight. I polish off the first pile in 4 days. A new one, even higher, arrives soon after. Late afternoon, when I'm hardest at work, Mr. Archibald sees my concentration. It's marked by my cross expression and the hardening of my hands. He says he's always known I could buckle down. Occasionally I'll take a break and go to the library, taking the long way past the Swins' property. The deterioration of hope has begun. I see it in the wind-torn corners of Whitney's posters and in the fortress silence of the house. Someone has placed a bouquet at the base of an elm tree under Whitney's photograph, and the sight reminds me of the many shrines people set up at the scenes of car accidents. There's an air of grieving here, but elsewhere neglect predominates. Today, Whitney's picture wasn't on the front page or even the second. I've been thinking about her, how her farm must feel. Another week passes and I'm finished with the second pile. I shine a flashlight down the well, but still I can't see where the filler ends and the emptiness begins. I shout into the darkness, no swearing this time. My echo bounces back quicker than before, from behind. Mr. Agrawal approaches. I can hear his bare feet padding over the stumps and nubs of the creepers, which have already started to recover. I reckon you'll need another truckload, he says. I reckon you're right. Fine, I'll place the order. With my buckets empty, I decided to return my Morse call, finally. The trill of her voice irritates me as soon as she answers. Jaishri, she stresses the first syllable urgently. Didn't you get my message? How are you? I stammer. We never truly have conversations any further, just these awkward volleys. I'm okay. I hope you're taking care of Grandfather. Have you been studying your geometry book, and what of chemistry? It's true that I failed 2 classes this past year. English is the only one I consistently pass. I scrape by not because I do the assignments, but because the teacher knows that when I'm not paying attention, it's usually because I have a novel in my lap. She's taken me aside a couple of times. Why don't I do my homework? Why don't I participate? Why don't I live up to my potential? She wants to know. I tell her the truth. I don't pay attention to her lectures. I don't study, and I don't care. I tell her flat out I can't be what she wants me to. I want to come home, I muttered, recognizing immediately that I've chosen the wrong tactic. What's wrong? What's going on? But I don't know how to explain or even where to begin. My silence, as usual, presumes guilt. You're not going anywhere, Jai. Not until September. I have to put my foot down this time. I told you that before you left. The counselor did too, remember? I'm still thinking of how to reframe my argument when she hangs up. I hold out the receiver, which is old and chunky, then start pounding it on a lazy boy. 10, 20, 30 times. I pound it until the hatred ebbs, until my fingers gnarl up and pale and rigid. Mr. Agrawal's there when I stop. I have no idea how long he's been observing me. He walks out the door and onto the porch. I follow behind. There we assume our usual positions. Him on the plastic chair, me on a busted, moldy sofa. I inhale deeply, tasting lemon balm, sage, basil, and of course mint. The lush, unruly leftovers from before my grandmother died. That's when I remember the most lovely scent of all, the fragrance of Whitney Swin's hair. I caught it only once, maybe twice, but what a bit of heaven it was. La fin. So the postlude is this. I wrote the first half of the story when I was a teenager. As I reworked it for the anthology, I felt a little worried. Though this is a work of fiction, I wondered if people would think I was trying to justify or even worse, endorse violence. What I did intend to do is explore the narrative's specific brand of resentment and alienation, common to some teenagers but magnified and potentially monstrous in this case. So, very interesting story. A number of thoughts occur after reading this. The author, Chandra Prasad, is very descriptive in her writing, and so there's obviously begins with the sense, SCENTS, and it continues throughout as the story is increasingly linear. There's less of it as it in the beginning and towards the end, but it's still throughout, and it's influential. Now I abstain from lending myself to the senses too much, and but there is a palpability, a tangibility that's established through those descriptions, and it sets the scene. It gives a feel, literally, for the conditions. And it's interesting to see her, or for the author to say, like, the most pleasing fragrance was the hair of the young girl. A lot of being said with that, and not necessarily comfortable, and it's not necessarily like clean, in terms of like the resolution. In my experience of reading that, there obviously there's appreciation. Let's see, there's a number of like contradictions, and that's life. So it's a matter of like, what's it called? Unpacking it. So One, the author, the narrator, I should say, the narrator is has obviously antagonism towards feels antagonism towards the daughter, particularly because of what the daughter does to set her up. So there's that animosity. So then for her to say that the best smell that she's ever had was the scent of the girl's hair, it's like, oh, what are you talking about? You don't like her, so how's that going to be? How are you going to like after all these descriptions of the mint and the basil and everything else? You're going to say it's the girl's hair. So there's that. But then there's also like the racial tension, the undertone of like the racial resentment and the persecution, everything else like that. And so is it? Oh wait a minute, you're selling out because you want to favor this girl's hair or whatever else? I'm getting another warning about storage, so I'm going to pause here and then continue on.